My mom's telling my sister to be quiet.
Hailey, if you're ready, we can get started. Are you ready to roll? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This is Leora at the center. I'm super pleased to introduce Hailey Algoe today. You probably all know her as your friend and president of your student council. I know her as a beloved member of the Center for American Architecture and Design team. And Hailey got a scholarship last summer to travel to Japan and research the architecture of convenience stores. And I am so happy that she's here today to share the results of her research with us. Hailey, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to do this. When I initially agreed to do a Goldsmith talk, I guess I imagined it a little differently than this, but this is okay too. And thank you guys so much for all taking the time out of your days to come hear about my research. I just want to make sure, can everybody see the slides? Yes, slides only, full screen, we're all good?
Hey, Tay, could you mute your mic? I think we're getting a bit of an echo.
Hey, Tate, mute your mic. Okay, thank you. Cool, all right, in that case, I will get started. So I received a scholarship from the James and Joanne Pratt Foundation, fund for Japan travel. This was a scholarship that was created in memory of James Pratt, who was an architect in the Dallas area. And his wife created this endowment to fund student research travel in the School of Architecture to Japan. And I was really honored to be the first recipient of that. And it was just a wonderful experience. So with that kind of thank you out there, I will dive right in. So I want to talk first a little bit about the definition of the term KONBINI, which is something that you'll probably hear me say a lot throughout the presentation. KONBINI is short for kind of like Japaneseified English word convenience store, KONBINI store. So KONBINI is basically a small-scale Japanese convenience stores which sell pre-prepared food, basic ingredients, snacks, toiletries, and other kind of conveniences. These also function as hubs for some kind of civic and everyday services. They have fax and copy services, courier and postal services. They sell tickets for concerts and theme parks. You can pay your utility bills, or even in some cities, you can pay your taxes at the KONBINI. And of course, they all have ATMs as well. So there are over 40,000 convenience stores in Japan, with the biggest 3 companies being these 3, 7-Eleven, Lawson, and Family Mart. 7-Eleven and Lawson originally started as American companies, but really took hold in Japan to the extent where I believe Lawson is now only a Japanese company. There are no longer any in the US. And Family Mart is the only one of those 3 who started in Japan. But basically those 3 companies are ubiquitous. There are a few other convenience store chains, but these 3 are the ones that I definitely saw the most during my travels. And so these were the 3 that I decided to focus on. So kind of in strict comparison to American convenience stores, KONBINI are usually not associated with gas stations. In dense urban areas, this is kind of to be expected, as many people utilize transit rather than transportation by car. But even in the rural areas I visited, I found that gas stations were usually divorced from KONBINI. To draw on a familiar example for most of us here, this is probably the type of convenience store model that most of us are used to in kind of the urban sprawl of the US, the model of the gas station store, where you maybe stop in after filling up your car and then go on your way. This particular 7-Eleven, which is also probably rather familiar to us, is more aligned with the model of stores that are most common in Japan, which is a pre-existing building adapted for use as a convenience store, then branded as a 7-Eleven, and very much accessible in the daily pedestrian kind of flow of the street. This presents kind of a different model of use than in American convenience stores, which is more similar to the kind of urban bodega model of shopping. Workers stop in for snacks over the course of the day, stop by at breakfast, or pop in to buy small amounts of groceries. KONBINI are definitely more commonly seen in urban areas, but most of the more rural towns I visited also had at least one. In the dense urban kind of centers of Tokyo and Osaka, it wasn't uncommon for me to stand on one side of the street under a 7-Eleven and then turn to the other side to see another one right across the way, which I have a little video of right here, if it will play. 7-Eleven here, 7-Eleven here. That's like the kind of ubiquity of how dense these are in the fabric of the city. And this also kind of speaks to their ubiquity in the minds of most people. Even though they inhabit many different buildings and many different layouts, each KONBINI effectively feels the same to the user within developed brand typologies, providing a kind of reassuring familiarity and consistency. And it's in this way that the KONBINI has become less of an architectural form and more of almost an element of landscape for its users, kind of an extension into the ultimate realm of personal comfort, which is the home. Since living spaces tend to be very small in cities like Osaka and Tokyo in Japan, refrigerators and food storage space is typically limited, not to mention the limited space in the fabric of the city for kind of sprawling megastore style supermarkets. In fact, in Tokyo, not most, but many grocery stores have to exist in the basement levels of department stores, since above ground space is at such a premium. So in this way, the convenience store is an easy place to stop by on your way home from work to pick up a carton of milk, to make dinner, or a cup of noodles if you're feeling lazy. Another aspect of convenience stores is that supply chains have the opportunity to be highly tailored and personalized to the demographics of people who tend to shop at certain stores. Each store can kind of frequently rotate in and out seasonal goods and special products corresponding to the collected demographics of those who shop at that particular store. Additionally, merchandise circulates through these doors really fast, and some of them receive up to 5 different shipments of fresh products every day. So the turnover is pretty fast. That's some basic kind of background on convenience stores in Japan. My particular research was focused a bit more on the facade architecture of convenience stores in the kind of view from the public realm of the street. I had the opportunity to travel over a lot of Japan over the course of a month, from huge metropolitan centers to mid-sized cities to some small, more rural towns. So this is kind of a basic map of the areas that my research was focused on. I was first interested in KONBINI because of their ability to seemingly slot in anywhere in the urban fabric of a city. You'll see stores nestled between larger buildings, occupying ground floors of towering structures, or tucked away in corners of stations and malls. But there's a connecting thread through all of these situations, which is that the stores never actually feel that different. I wanted to explore the way that through corporate branding and standardized signage, these stores are able to become urban chameleons, kind of unquestioned parts of daily life, completely ordinary, even in extraordinary sighting conditions. I'm very interested in the work of the Japanese metabolists, and despite the fact that some of their original theory was rooted in some kind of Marxist leanings, I think it's curious that some of their theories on mutable city building as a biological process have actually been perfectly exemplified by one of the most capitalist systems imaginable. The KONBINI is a perfectly context-adaptable form, able to inhabit space in any type of building, readily available to morph its floor plan to restrictive spatial constraints. It has no iconic form. Its strength lies in its variability to perfectly nestle into forgotten nooks and crannies of the urban landscape, forming an ecosystem of connections to its neighboring stores through complex supply chains. In that way, very much the kind of biological model of the city that the metabolists originally envisioned. Whoop, my slides are frozen. Whoop, wrong way. Okay, so in the course of my research, a lot of which involved the kind of tried and true cultural landscapes technique of just wandering around and looking and listening, I cataloged somewhere around 130 different convenience stores across Japan, and a few distinct categories emerged in terms of the architectural strategies that these buildings used to inhabit space in the city. So I want to talk about each of them briefly and show you guys some photos, and then at the end, hopefully have some time for questions and discussion among everybody here. So the different categories that I delineated are the first floor parasite, dominant parasite, small box store, bottom of the heap, indoor storefront, and finally the very creative title of unique, which we will get to. So first, I want to talk about the first floor parasite model. This was by far kind of the most abundant that I found. Particularly in Tokyo, there were tons of examples of this layout. Generally nondescript, multi-story building without any real clues to the identity of its higher floors at street level, completely dominated by the convenience store program slotted into its bottom floor. The floors above it might be housing or offices or anything. It doesn't particularly matter, because with the few gestures available in the architectural vernacular of the convenience store, namely the kind of iconic branding of their banner signs and glass front facades, they completely co-opt any identity the building might otherwise have in the eyes of the passerby. Some of the examples of this typology, like these, were stores at the bottom of very nondescript buildings, generic kind of high-rise apartments. Some, however, were actually at the feet of pretty architecturally fascinating structures, which presented a bit of a different condition when looking at them from a distance. Generally, though, when you're walking down a dense street, you still interpret these only as convenience stores. The mere presence of the KONBINI has kind of an anonymizing effect to the architecture which it is attached to. These are just a few other buildings that I actually really liked architecturally, whose ground floors had been completely kind of claimed into this realm of the commercial. The next subset that I wanted to talk about, I called the dominant parasite, which is kind of a subset of the first floor parasite category. In this category, the structure on top of the konbini is so subdued, usually due to size. Most of the buildings I classified in this category only had 1 or 2 floors atop their ground floor. But the rest of the structure is so subdued that the konbini kind of completely usurps the building. Unlike the first floor parasite category, stores in this one aren't high-rise towers with a convenience store at their base. Rather, they're convenience stores with a bonus floor on top. Konbini completely becomes the primary program here. This category was much more common in suburbs and quieter and less dense areas of cities. I think that what most of us generally think of as kind of prototypical urban Japanese architecture involves massive skyscrapers and extreme density. It's kind of, you know, the cyberpunk image of, you know, super neon Tokyo. But these kind of eclectic structures, which showcase a variety of everyday styles of construction, are almost the most quintessentially urban Japanese to me. And I look at them with a real kind of sense of nostalgia. The next category I want to talk about follows a fairly consistent format for the most part and will probably look the most familiar to those of us who grew up anywhere in the US outside of the densest urban centers. I called this category small box store because of its highly regimented freestanding structure. These are the types of designs that each of the 3 big convenience store companies hires architects to design from the ground up and place anywhere in the country, which is kind of a familiar contemporary commercial model of architecture. As you can see between these 2 images, though, this category does have the potential to manifest differently in different contexts. What I would call independent but nestled, still kind of packed closely into the urban landscape next to its neighbors, or on the right, completely freestanding and kind of maintaining a healthy distance from its surroundings. This model was by far the most common in the rural towns that I visited, where konbini are far less common, as there's more space to build large grocery stores, people have more space to store food, and therefore they can go longer in between grocery trips, eliminating the need for the kind of everyday convenient shopping that konbini provide. Also, more people commute via car, and so the stores kind of don't have the potential for that drop-in pedestrian traffic. Of course, in these kind of rural small towns, it's also not necessary to adapt konbini to the ground floors of pre-existing buildings when there aren't that many pre-existing multi-story buildings. This konbini was the only one in the town of Bie in Hokkaido, which has a population of around 10,000 people, and I think like a population density of around 15 people per square kilometer. This one was right in the kind of downtown of the little small town center, and it definitely catered to people who worked in that area, as well as sightseers who were visiting the visitor center next door, which is like a jumping off point to take bus tours of the famous flower fields in the area. This store in Hakodate illustrates another fairly everyday kind of shop in a less rural environment, but still far from the densely packed centers of Tokyo or Osaka. Definitely of note here, as well as in the last image and the next one that I'll show, is the car parking, which was really uncommon in most of the konbini that I saw. Even though this 7-Eleven was right along Hakodate's cable car line, most of the people that I saw going in and out were commuting by car. And I think that this definitely illustrates a different pattern of use than the kind of pop-in pedestrian traffic common in Japanese cities. And it's something that I would definitely like to explore further. This family mart was in the most rural town that I visited, called Tsurugi in Ishikawa Prefecture, just outside of Kanazawa. Not only was this the only konbini in town, it was also the only ATM in town that would take my foreign credit card. I ran out of cash while I was visiting here, and the train station in this town was so small and old that they didn't take IC cards, which are basically like little RFID wallets that you can use to get onto most train lines in the country. So I had to walk a mile from the station to this family mart, which I knew would have an international ATM because no matter where you are in the country, all of them do. Then I managed to miss the next train and had to wait like an hour for another. And this whole thing was kind of a reminder that convenience stores are really not as universal in Japan as I had perhaps imagined outside of dense city centers. These are some more small box stores in more urban contexts in both Hiroshima and Osaka, respectively. The one on the left is right across from one of Hiroshima's most popular okonomiyaki restaurants, which is a really popular regional food. And it's just like 100 meters from the A-bomb dome in the Memorial Peace Park. But the site, the sighting kind of has no reference to the kind of horrors that befell it a few decades ago. This was a really interesting urban environment. So again, some of the stores in this category I grouped into a bit of a subcategory, which I called independent but nestled. These are definitely freestanding structures, but they have buildings pressed against them on either side in such a way that they read to the pedestrian's eye as just another part of the flow of facades on either side of a dense street. So this next typology encapsulates, I think, a lot of what originally intrigued me about urban Japan and convenience stores in particular, which is the kind of verticality of the commercial landscape. When you're looking for a restaurant or store, it's almost rarely ever right at ground level. In certain areas where the facades are densely packed with layers of signs, your eye has to become trained to look up and read the signs as signifiers of the businesses that lie within. A lot of the most extreme examples of this actually came not from Tokyo, which is what I might have expected, but Osaka, in the extremely commercial areas around Dotonbori and Amemura. Often the most valuable ground real estate of these stacked buildings is taken up by the konbini, the program that kind of needs to be the most accessible and also has the potential to lure in customers on a repeating basis who might eventually patronize the stores or restaurants above out of a developed kind of sense of comfort or familiarity. Here more than anywhere else, I think that a really key lesson from the konbini is abundantly clear. In this typology, form is kind of irrelevant to program. The signage is the architecture, stripes and neon and glowing signs signaling to passersby all that they need to know, and the building underneath kind of becomes irrelevant. In a kind of Venturian, Denise Scott Brown, learning from Las Vegas mode of considering this, this is almost the height of the decorated shed, where the shed becomes completely irrelevant. The shed is the decoration, or the decoration is the shed. In some cases, like some of the more intriguing works of architecture we saw earlier with konbini affixed to the bottom, some of these buildings are even ducks, but decorated all the same. If you haven't read Learning from Las Vegas and you have no idea what I'm talking about, I apologize if there are any lay people in the crowd. I think my mom is watching. So these decorated ducks in a sea of decoration complete the transmogrification of these extremely commercial spaces into what is perceived as the domain of the public. The parasitism of architecture by advertising and consumerism is so accepted in the Japanese cultural landscape that konbini's motivations begin to seem innocuous among pachinko parlors and fast food restaurants. It's a place for everyday functions to be carried out. It's neutral and its parasitism is completely accepted. This next category is really interesting and I think again speaks to the ability of the konbini to adapt to any space. These interior storefronts sometimes take the form of small box stores, somewhat independent structures, just sited in an interior context, usually a train or a subway station. Some of them take the form of a more traditional kind of mall-style forefront. These two were each from major stations where bullet trains converged from all across the country, and you can see that the architectural elements of the station converge overhead at the intersection of a kind of grand civic architecture of transportation and an innocuous commercial architecture. Train station konbini were particularly interesting to me because they kind of adjusted some of their product offerings in interesting ways. This one in Kanazawa functioned partially as a souvenir store, In Japanese culture, there's a practice of kind of buying regional foods or treats as omiyage or souvenirs to give to your friends and coworkers after you come back from a trip. And some of these train station konbini also functioned as kind of hotspots for last minute omiyage before you hop back on the train to head home. This is another example of a train station konbini in Hakodate, where I first got off the train after a 4-hour ride from Tokyo all the way up to Hokkaido, which is the North Island of Japan. This one had a really notable collection of prepackaged meals suitable to eat on the train. Typically eating in public and on subways is really discouraged in Japanese culture, but on long train rides, particularly on Shinkansen, the bullet trains, there's a whole genre of food, of bento boxes called ekibin, just for the occasion of having a meal on your ride. This 7-Eleven was inside of Nara's train station, and it was explicitly catered towards tourist interests particularly. Not just omiyage, but also general trinkets and souvenirs related to the famous landmarks and deer who inhabit this town. This is something that you definitely would not see in just your general run-of-the-mill konbini in like Akasaka and Tokyo, like a more innocuous district. And finally, this is one of my favorite indoor storefronts at the base of the Tokyo Skytree station, which had just kind of layers and layers of escalators unfolding above, providing like a transition space out of the station and into the realm of the Skytree, which is basically a giant multi-story department store / mall. Another kind of subgenre of these that manifest differently are located in subway stations rather than at above ground train stations. These tend to be a lot smaller and carry specifically tailored goods to the demographics of folks who most often use the particular train line that they're located along. Certain types of snacks, newspapers or manga for businessmen, certain beverages. These tend to be a lot smaller with super constrained interiors and generally way less food on offer because, again, eating on the subway is super frowned upon. Another example of being able to tailor more to specific demographics can be seen in this Natural Lawson. Lawson in particular has taken the approach of creating a few different brand types tailored to slightly different products and demographics rather than just tailoring stock within each of their generic stores. Namely, they've created specific branding for health food selections, expanded grocery selections, and expanded pharmacy sections. This shows kind of, again, the utilization of signage as the primary tell for this architectural form. You know what program you're getting and what type of products you're getting purely due to the two-dimensional accents kind of affixed to the facade, which then in turn become the facade. These interior storefronts aren't restricted just to stations. They popped up in some other really interesting places, even ones where the typical pop-in convenience model didn't really make a ton of sense. This one, which is one of the only konbini I ever saw which didn't utilize the typical branding and signage, was inside of a project called T-Site Daikanyama, which is a huge, sprawling, multi-building complex of a single bookstore. Here, it was pretty clear that this specific konbini was no longer really about convenience at all, but rather Family Mart taking up an opportunity to sell higher end products in a more kind of chic and bougie setting than what they're used to. I saw this as kind of a little experiment in what feels appropriate for the brand of a konbini and how far they can kind of push the model of convenience. Indoor konbini also popped up in airports, in malls, and even on train platforms, layering several interesting layers of interiority and exteriority. So the final category that I want to talk about, I've titled, again, not very creatively, unique, meaning that these are structures clearly built by each of these companies to be convenience stores, but they've been intentionally architecturalized and given a bit more intrigue than the typical innocuous small box store model. These would sometimes pop up in locations that definitely had a lot of tourist traffic and would be intentionally styled with cues to the local vernacular or style. This one at the ferry port to Itsukushima Island clearly references some traditional structures you might associate with a historic religious district. And the banner overhead of the 7-Eleven sign kind of proclaims in a very stylized traditional font that omiyage can be found here. This building, which is just right within view of the famous Yokohama International Port Terminal, kind of embraces its site with some nautical referentialism and also incorporates a rest house element for weary travelers. Some of these unique stores, though, were just kind of tucked away on average streets, like this kind of elaborate procession into a 7-Eleven under a faux torii gate in Kyoto. This wasn't a particularly touristy area, which really made me wonder how these companies decide which stores to build as more architecturally intriguing and which they use a typical kind of small box store model for. So finally, I want to come to some concluding thoughts. For me, what kind of began as an exploration of the notion of convenience turned more into a study in parasitism, branding, and the erasure of monumentality. In an environment where the commercial is so familiar so as to become part of the domain of the ordinary, of the civic, the neutral. I would see folks sitting down in the seating areas of Konbini in the morning, enjoying breakfast and reading newspapers. And this certainly does not align with the American notion of convenience, which is to have things super accessible, to stop in and grab and go. I think that because free public space is at such a premium in the kind of hyper-capitalist domain of dense urban centers like Tokyo, a space where you can pay like $1 or $2 for a coffee and an onigiri rice ball and sit and eat has to kind of become almost public, even though of course it is still behind a paywall. All in all, I think that the Konbini is an interesting illustration of the power of corporations to manipulate the architecture which they occupy. They can intentionally wash it out through their occupation, particularly by means of their intimacy at the level of the street and the most personal part of the city. But they can also draw attention to it via exception, popping up in places that we least expect and in forms that highlight their programs. These two approaches were both really interesting to me, but I think all in all, the most notable thing I took away was that Japanese people who would see me taking pictures of convenience stores always seemed a little bit bemused that I was taking photos of them at all when I tried to explain why, because to them, this is just a part of their life, and it really makes no difference whether a konbini is at the base of a skyscraper or inside of a bookstore. Either way, it's everyday, commonplace, and convenient. That's all I got. I would love to hear questions and continue the discussion.
Yeah, I would say if anyone here has a question, if you want to raise their hand, we can call on you and you can unmute yourself. We had a question a little bit early on from Tate about the names being spelled out in English or Japanese. Tate, are you referring to in print? Hailey, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, are you talking about like the kind of branding of the stores?
Hold on. Yeah, that was actually me who asked that, but it's kind of interesting to me. Like, it's all in English. Like, even the Family Mart one, which I think you said was started in Japan and it's like mostly Japanese, is still spelled out in English. I was wondering like if you knew any more about that and why.
Yeah, so Japanese is really interesting because there are effectively like 4 different alphabets. There's like kanji, which is the writing style adapted from Chinese. There's hiragana, which kind of phonetically spells things out and is mixed in with kanji in typical writing. And then there's katakana, which is a whole alphabet that's just for spelling out loan words. And And then you can also spell things out in English. And katakana and English typically tend to have like a sense of being cool to them. Like it seems very like kind of hip internet youth culture. I think in the one that I showed where, let me see if I can go back. The one that was in, sorry if I'm going too fast. The one store that didn't use the typical branding, the kind of sign at the top says Famima, which is like the abbreviation for Family Mart. And that's spelled out in katakana, which I think again kind of speaks to the fact that they were trying to make this into more of like a chic experiment. But it's pretty common in a lot of Japanese branding to see things spelled out in English. I'm not an expert or anything, but that's kind of my take on it.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Joseph says, what was my favorite convenience store? I was really taken with this one that was just chilling out on this train platform. But I also really loved this 7-Eleven that had like the procession to get back to the store. And it was just like really needlessly ceremonial. Like it was a super average street, nothing like particularly special about this store, but the kind of gravity that was given to it, I thought was really interesting. Before I went, I actually put out a call online on some forums to ask if people had any convenience stores that they had come across in their travels in Japan that they thought were particularly interesting. And this was one that somebody mentioned to me, so I took a little pilgrimage to see it specifically. Any other questions or comments or? Okay, Mike says, is there any materiality that stood out to me? The materiality was like, I mean, you have kind of the two categories, right? The ones that kind of slot into the pre-existing structures, a lot of which are concrete, a lot of them are constructed probably in the 80s when the Japanese economy kind of had a bubble thing going on and tons of new construction was happening. Most of the ones that were then constructed from the ground up are brick, really similar to what you would probably see in the US. And those are the ones that definitely felt a lot more innocuous to me just because of what I'm used to. But every once in a while, you would stumble across some that were materially interesting. I think that these ones definitely speak to that, this kind of interesting, like, I don't even know, aluminum facade on this one on the right here in Hiroshima. This one on the left that was in Osaka was also just super fascinating, like a little circular structure for no particular reason. But generally the materiality really isn't super significant to them, I don't think. Sarah asks about the interiors being standardized. And that's definitely something that I think would be a next step for me to dive into, would be to compare floor plans between all of them. They have to be pretty adaptable because sometimes the spaces that they have to inhabit, that they're taking over, are pretty small. So, you know, there has to be some flexibility in the kind of layouts, but generally you have, you know, like a drink cooler on one wall, kind of prepackaged goods on one wall, aisles in the middle that have chips and snacks and that sort of thing. And then at the front by the counter, there's always the hot food. And then I feel like usually the wall closest to the entrance has some of the more civic functions like ATMs and whatnot. I don't know, I call those civic functions also because you can pay your taxes there, which I think kind of speaks to the incorporation of these into the kind of realm of the everyday. Also, if any of you guys have follow-up questions or feel like I'm not answering things well, please feel free to ask. Professor Benedict asks about Learning from Las Vegas. I actually read Learning from Las Vegas after returning from this trip, and I think that it's a really, really valuable way to look at commercial vernacular spaces. I think that it still provides a really good framework, and in some of their research on billboards specifically, I really thought about that in the context of the KONBINI signage. And I think it is a really valuable kind of cultural landscapes text almost, which I know that it's not necessarily what it was originally envisioned as maybe. But you know, it's the first text that really looked at the everyday of lesser structures as having architectural relevance. So I definitely saw my kind of framing of this as being pretty influenced by it. Also J.B. Jackson, yes. I'm in Professor Lopez's class right now, and we've read some J.B. Jackson, and I think that in terms of more of like the small town American landscape, he definitely did that as well. Gabe asks about the design solution of future American convenience stores in Japan, or do you think drive-through stores will be next in the US? Where do the paths cross? That is not a poorly worded question. I think that's a really interesting point, and something that I thought a lot about in terms of how this could transfer over to the US. I think that in New York City, where bodegas are really common, you kind of already have a bit of this model, although of course they don't have as sophisticated supply chains and like constant deliveries and networks that form across the city between bodegas. So this kind of already works there. But in terms of kind of the rest of America, pretty much anything outside of like dense inner city New York or Chicago, or not even really LA, because LA is a little bit more of like a sprawling city. I think that this model doesn't work as well, and I think that you can see that in places in some of the more rural towns where I visited, there were only like one or two KONBINI. It's also interesting to see some of people's discussion about how things have changed with the pandemic going on currently. I think that Japan has been kind of slow to respond to things, but already people are running into a problem where typically the way that people in Tokyo especially do their grocery shopping is by stopping by the KONBINI, stopping by this mom and pop shop that sells this vegetable, but I need to stop over here to buy rice because they have a better price here. And that way of shopping has really not become as feasible. And also just the fact that people don't have a ton of food storage, I think is going to be an issue in terms of how frequently they have to go out to get food. I don't know, that was very rambly. Gabe, I'm sorry. Dean Addington, please ask aloud. Go for it.
Sorry about that, because I have a hard time wording my questions as well. When I think about the salient differences, actually, when you start to include all of the regional convenience stores we have in the US, and I'm not just Buc-ee's, but Wawa, Cumberland Farms, all of those. I think if when you start looking at that as an entire suite of options, you're going to hit on all of your different types within that. So what do you feel is the aspect that most differentiates what would be the landscape of convenience stores and the broad landscape of convenience stores in this country versus what you saw in Japan?
I think that there are two primary things. I think one is the way that we think about the role of convenience in these stores between the two. I think that convenience stores in the US are usually not a place that you linger. I think that they're a place where you stop in and grab something and then go on your way for the rest of your day. And that was not necessarily always what I saw in Japan. A lot of these stores had little seating areas. Some of them even would have like upper floor seating areas where you would go upstairs and you can still smoke indoors in a lot of places in Japan. So there might be like a smoking room where businessmen would grab some food downstairs, go upstairs, read the newspaper. So again, I think that the fact that convenience stores function a bit more as public space in Japan than they do in the US, I think that's one difference. And I think the second key difference is actually the type of products that are carried, which I wish that I wish that I could dive a little bit more into. I think that I might have needed to network a little bit with these companies to look into their supply chains and how they actually choose what to carry specifically at each store. But generally, the type of food that is carried at these stores are, I mean, it's not like super healthy food, but I think generally it's a lot healthier than what you find at American convenience stores. And so it has the kind of ability to make these into more of an everyday feasible destination. Whereas in the US, I think you see convenience stores actually contributing a lot to healthy food deserts, where, you know, a neighborhood might only have a few bodegas or convenience stores where you can go get whatever, some taquitos and or like a hot dog or chips or soda. And that's kind of all that's available. So I think that in that way, we might be able to actually look at this model in terms of moving that to the US. But part of it also probably has to do just with the differences in typical diet between Japan and the US. I hope that kind of answers some of the stuff, because I agree, like some of this stuff you probably definitely could also see in American convenience stores, especially between the different regional brands. I've always been super obsessed since I moved a lot as a kid with like different regional grocery stores. But regional convenience stores are super interesting as well. Sarah asks, does Japan have any mega grocery stores like the US, like a 2-story super Target or something similar? Not typically on that scale. They definitely do have like supermarket grocery stores like we do in the town where I talked about, where I had to go to the Family Mart to get money from the ATM. I actually first headed over to a grocery store in the town, hoping to find an ATM there, but did not. But you know, like small towns definitely do have grocery stores and people shop there a lot more than they shop at the konbini. But like mega stores are not as common. I think even at Costco in Japan, they don't sell as much in bulk as they do in the US. Again, I'm not an expert, but that's my kind of general perception. Moving to Aubrey, because convenience stores are a relatively new phenomenon, did you look into their origins both in general and in Japan? And on the flip side, where you see them going in the future, is there an evolution of their physical presence that might come with changes in our cities? So I did look a lot at the origins of the convenience store in Japan, which is pretty interesting. It really came into they first kind of started in the 70s. I think a lot of it has to do with the whole post-war Japan kind of environment and the evolution into the economic bubble era in the 1980s. And it's really curious that the model did like just really like find kind of almost the perfect environment to grow in Japan. Like I see them as more ubiquitous in Japan, even as in the US, even though originally I think that they are more of an American concept. I haven't looked as much at the history of them in general in the US. That's definitely something I would like to get into a little bit. In terms of future evolution of their physical presence, like I was saying, I think in the context of the current pandemic that's going on, it's going to change a lot of things and change the way that people frame things. On one hand, you know, having these on every block and having maybe a store really accessible to you that you don't have to go all around the city or go to the grocery store to get your food is good, but also I think it means that you have to go out a lot more frequently, which in the context of a pandemic is probably not ideal. I think I talked a little bit about how I see the model of the types of food that they carry maybe being applicable to American food deserts. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that right now. Nick says that the entry procession to many of these stores are very unique. The corner entry seemed very prominent throughout your images. Was that a dominant typology? And if so, did you find a specific reason as to why? You know, I actually think that it's interesting that you noticed that, because in my mind, I feel like the most dominant kind of entry to me was more of like a front entrance like this. I think in my head, I like to imagine these as being more like slotted into the urban landscape. But now that you mention it, I guess there are a lot that kind of go around corners. I think like from a practical standpoint, that gets you more pedestrian traffic from people coming from both sides of the street. A corner location is always kind of more lucrative. But yeah, I don't know. That's definitely good point. I will think about that. But yeah, in my head, this is kind of more what I imagine as the typical procession, where you're walking along kind of dense storefront and turn and then go right into the front. But I guess both of them exist for sure. Gabe says, are the convenience stores more expensive than grocery stores in Japan like they are in the US? Generally, no. I didn't feel like it, at least. One of the big advantages of these is how cheap things are. Obviously, you're not going to go do all of your grocery shopping here. So, you know, if you are going to pick up like ingredients for a full meal, then it might end up being a little bit more expensive. But, you know, I could get like a thing of edamame for like the equivalent of like $1. I could get like a little pre-made soba meal for like the equivalent of like $2 or $3. Generally, I felt like things are pretty affordable, but again, you would not want to do all of your shopping here. Tammy says, thinking about the stores that take up the bottom level of these superstructures, especially ones that seem to be architecturally significant, what ways do you think the design has to give? In what ways do you think the design has to give to the existence of the convenience store? Tammy, that does not make a ton of sense to me. Can you say it out loud?
Yeah, sorry. So like just
no worries.
Just thinking maybe, I don't know what comes first, you know, the design of those super big structures or the convenience stores, but in what ways do they have to consider the existence of one another? Like looking at the really architecturally significant ones, but having the entire bottom, you know, street side taken up by a 7-Eleven, I'm thinking, you know, how do I know how to access that building that sits on top of it? So just things like that.
Mm-hmm. So I think that most of these are, you know, almost always retrofitted. The convenience stores are retrofitted to the space, although a lot of them probably are designed intentionally with the conception of having some sort of commercial space on the bottom. It's interesting to look. I think the kind of building on the furthest left here reads to me as being a little bit older than the two on the right. So could have been built before having convenience stores or commercial space on the bottom was as ubiquitous. So I think it's interesting to see how those types of buildings adapt to it versus the two on the right, where I feel like you can see a little bit more, particularly with the one in the middle, that, you know, there's like a recess into it, and the convenience store is like a different, very much kind of has like a different spatial realm to it. Sometimes it is very confusing to figure out how to get up to the upper levels of these. The convenience stores do kind of tend to dominate them. But I guess that's true of a lot of structures that have commercial space on their bottom levels. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, the relationship in terms of time is also pretty interesting to think about. A little bit of a chicken and egg situation. Ting says, You talked a bit about how these convenience stores will sometimes scale down to become smaller depending on location, but I'm curious, does the opposite ever happen? Do these convenience stores ever become 2 stories or wider/longer stores? That is a really good question. I think that there were a few, particularly that one in Yokohama that was like abnormally large. Those are usually ones that are intended to be like destinations. Sorry, I'm going through the whole thing. Like this is like a Lawson that everybody in Yokohama knows about. It's like a place also that has like a restaurant attached to it. I think that they take on a bigger size when they are intending to draw attention to the brand rather than to just be a part of everyday life. Again, whenever I would see one that would be 2 stories, usually the second story, like this one on the right here, would be kind of like a dining area. On the window it says up there, eat in. So basically a place for you to sit and eat the food that you buy there. Again, like eating food while you're walking in public is pretty frowned upon in Japan. So again, I think kind of like adapting the space to that different notion of convenience can also be a reason why they expand and get bigger. Megan says, would the typology of konbini in Japan speak to a larger cultural view of how Eastern countries use convenience stores in comparison to Western countries? I think definitely. And a little bit of research that I've done about this is that this kind of model of convenience store did start in Japan, but it has become pretty common in other East Asian countries. I think you see konbini style convenience stores in the Philippines and Taiwan and Singapore and Korea. It definitely has spread to those. And I think that a lot of the cultural considerations are probably similar in terms of the difference between them and the style of convenience stores we have in Western countries. Chandler says, a lot of your observations of these convenience stores are comparing typologies in and of themselves and how they relate to their architectural situations. Were convenience stores densely located enough to begin responding to / interacting with each other? That's also a really good question. And I think I might like to actually do some sort of GIS study of the siting of different like brands or chains in relation to each other. There were definitely times like that video I showed at the very beginning when you definitely would feel like, I mean, it's like when you have like gas stations in the US that are like right across the street from each other and their like prices are different and they're constantly like adjusting them to compete with each other. I think that that's definitely a factor in these convenience stores as well. But yeah, that would definitely be something to look into. Some of them are densely located enough where you could stand in one place and they definitely kind of interface with each other. So yes, interesting point. That was a lot of like rambling off the top of my head, so I apologize if anything did not make sense. Does anybody have any other questions or comments? Y'all can also feel free to say stuff out loud if you would like. Oh, you're welcome, Chandler. Thank you.
Hailey, thank you. This was awesome and kind of off the beaten path for all of us. I really appreciate your presenting.
Yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate everybody coming out on a Wednesday night to your computer.
All right, well, we have this recorded and we can distribute if anyone wants to see again or talk further with Hailey. Just contact me, Leora at austin.utexas. And thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.